I am Kendra, 32 years old, and for 3 decades my parents raised my brother as a prince and me as their personal servant. They always told me some children are just born to stay in the shadows, while others are meant to shine. At my brother's lavish wedding rehearsal dinner, my mother shoved a tray of appetizers into my hands and ordered me to serve his wealthy guests. I swallowed the humiliation, assuming this was just another night of being the family scapegoat. I had no idea that my future sister-in-law's wealthy father was watching my every move. He snapped a single photograph of my face, noticed something impossible about my eyes, and made one phone call that unraveled a $45 million lie. Before I share how I brought down my family's holy empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who underestimated your worth. The Oak Ridge Country Club was dripping in imported white roses and crystal decor. My father, Pastor Calvin, and my mother, First Lady Beatrice, were holding court in the center of the grand ballroom, acting like royalty, bestowing their grace upon the congregation. They had spared absolutely no expense for their golden child. As a forensic accountant, I could not help but calculate the cost of the room. The champagne tower alone probably cost more than the tuition for my entire first year of community college. I was standing near the edge of the room, wearing a simple black dress, trying to stay out of the way. That was my designated role in this family, to be invisible, until someone needed a mess cleaned up. Pastor Calvin tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon, drawing the attention of the 300 affluent guests. He smiled brightly, his booming voice echoing across the ballroom. He raised his glass to my brother, praising Trey as the ultimate legacy of the Jenkins family, a man of exceptional character and business acumen. He spoke of blessings and divine favor, completely ignoring the fact that his own daughter was standing against the back wall like a hired hand. The crowd erupted into applause. I kept my hands folded in front of me, maintaining a neutral expression. My mother marched over to me the moment the applause died down. Her designer heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor. She did not offer a warm greeting or ask if I was enjoying the evening. Instead, she snatched a heavy silver tray of crab cakes from a passing waiter and shoved it directly into my chest. The heavy metal bruised my ribs, but I caught it before it fell. "You are wearing black anyway," Beatrice sneered, her voice dropping to that vicious whisper she reserved only for me. "Help the catering staff, because they are short-handed. You know your place is behind the scenes, Kendra. Do not stand around looking like a lost charity case when there is work to be done." I looked at the woman who was supposed to be my mother. Her perfect church smile was plastered on her face for the room, but her eyes were cold and dead when they looked at me. I took the tray. I did not argue or cry, because crying had never saved me in the Jenkins household. It only invited more punishment. I gripped the cold silver and walked toward the guest tables, plastering a polite retail smile on my face. Serving my own family felt like a twisted initiation rite. I navigated through the sea of wealthy church elders and Chloe's affluent relatives, offering appetizers and collecting empty glasses. When I approached the main VIP table, my brother Trey was holding court with his 5 groomsmen. Trey was 34, arrogant, and wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that I knew for a fact our parents had purchased. "Well, look who finally decided to make herself useful." Trey laughed loudly, ensuring the entire table was watching me. He nudged the groomsman next to him. "I told you my little sister would find a way to fit in. She always was good at cleaning up." I held out the tray, keeping my expression completely blank. "Crab cake tray?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. He smirked, taking 2 and tossing them onto his plate. "Nice shoes, Kendra," he mocked, pointing at my scuffed black heels. "Did you get those at a discount store clearance bin? You would think a glorified bookkeeper could afford a decent pair of pumps by now. But I guess counting other people's pennies does not pay very well." The groomsman chuckled dutifully. I stared at him, gripping the edge of the tray. I wanted to remind him that the only reason he could afford his designer lifestyle was because our parents handed him everything on a silver platter. Just last week, Pastor Calvin and First Lady Beatrice had purchased a luxury downtown condo for him and Chloe as an early wedding gift. They paid cash. Meanwhile, when I was 18, they told me the church funds were too tight to help with my education. I spent 4 years scrubbing the church pews, organizing bake sales, and working late-night shifts at a diner just to pay for my community college tuition. They raised him to be a king and trained me to be the help. Chloe leaned over, resting her hand on Trey's shoulder. She was 29, a woman born into generational wealth who looked at me like I was a smudge on the country club floor. "Leave her alone, baby," Chloe cooed with fake sympathy. "Not everyone has your ambition." She looked up at me, her eyes narrowing. "Though Kendra, you really should have worn something more appropriate for a rehearsal dinner. You look like you are going to a funeral." "Maybe I am," I replied smoothly. "The death of Trey's bachelor days." Chloe did not find it funny. She scoffed and turned away, sipping her champagne. "Just bring us some more napkins," she ordered, dismissing me entirely. I turned to walk away, but Beatrice suddenly appeared, blocking my path. She had seen the brief exchange, and her face was flushed with fury beneath her heavy makeup. She reached out and pinched the soft flesh at the back of my arm, her manicured nails digging in so hard I almost gasped. "What did I tell you about embarrassing your brother?" Beatrice hissed into my ear. "You are a worthless burden, Kendra. Do not ruin my perfect son's night with your bitter attitude. Now go to the kitchen and fetch more champagne." I pulled my arm away from her toxic grip. The sudden movement caused a half-empty champagne flute on my tray to tip over, spilling a few drops onto the carpet. Beatrice gasped as if I had committed a mortal sin. She snatched the tray right out of my hands, nearly knocking me off balance. "You cannot even do a simple task right," she spat, glaring at me with raw, unfiltered hatred. "Get out of my sight." I smoothed down my dress, my heart pounding a steady rhythm of suppressed rage against my ribs. I turned on my heel and walked toward the exit, the heavy double doors of the ballroom feeling miles away. What neither Beatrice nor Trey noticed was the man sitting quietly at the far end of the VIP table. Harrison Sterling, Chloe's father, was a retired estate attorney who had built his fortune on details and observation. He had not said a word during the entire exchange. He had simply watched. He watched the way Beatrice dug her nails into my arm. He watched the way Trey humiliated me. And he watched my face. As I passed under the massive crystal chandelier in the center of the room, the bright light caught my face perfectly. I paused for just a second to adjust my posture, refusing to let them see me run. Harrison Sterling raised his professional-grade camera, supposedly brought to capture candid memories of his daughter's rehearsal. He focused the lens directly on my face. He snapped a high-resolution photograph. I heard the faint click, but kept walking, pushing through the double doors and stepping out into the cool evening air of the parking lot. Inside the ballroom, Harrison lowered his camera and looked at the digital display on the screen. He zoomed in on my face, zooming past my forced smile straight to my eyes. I have a rare genetic trait called central heterochromia. My left eye is dark brown, but my right eye has a striking, vibrant splash of bright amber right near the pupil. Beatrice always hated it. She used to call it the mark of a stubborn child, an imperfection she wished she could somehow erase from my face. Harrison stared at the amber splash in my right eye. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like he had just seen a ghost. His hands began to tremble slightly as he lowered the camera. He knew that eye. He knew that exact amber splash because he had seen it on a client 30 years ago. A very wealthy, very dead client whose estate he had personally managed, without saying a word to his daughter or my abusive parents. Harrison stood up from the table and quickly walked out a side exit. He pulled his cell phone from his tailored suit pocket, his thumb moving rapidly across the screen. He dialed a number he had not called in years and held the phone to his ear, his eyes scanning the dark parking lot until he spotted me standing by my old sedan. "I need a favor at the lab," Harrison whispered into the phone, his gaze locked on me from the shadows of the club entrance. "I think I just saw a ghost and I need a DNA test immediately." I turned on my heel, ready to push through the heavy double doors and leave the stifling ballroom behind. I was completely exhausted and entirely done playing the obedient servant for a family that despised me. But before my hand could even touch the brass door handle, a perfectly manicured hand slammed flat against the wood, blocking my escape. It was Chloe. My future sister-in-law stood there blocking the exit with a smug smile plastered across her face. She held a black leather billfold in her other hand. The venue manager hovered nervously a few feet behind her. Going somewhere so soon, Kendra? She asked. Her voice was loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding tables. You cannot leave yet. We have a small issue with the venue management, and since you are already acting as the help tonight, I need you to handle it. She shoved the black leather billfold directly into my chest, forcing me to grab it before it hit the floor. I opened the folder. The receipt inside was printed on thick country club cardstock. It was the invoice for the premium open bar. The total at the bottom read $15,000. I looked up at her, keeping my face perfectly still. What is this, Chloe? It is the bar tab, she replied, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. Trey and I decided that since you did not buy us anything off our luxury registry, this can be your wedding gift to us. Go ahead and put your card down. The bartender is waiting. I stared at her, trying to process the sheer audacity of her demand. You want me to pay a $15,000 bar tab for a rehearsal dinner I was not even formally invited to attend? Chloe rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic sigh. Oh, please, Kendra, do not play the victim. We all know you can afford it. You literally do nothing but work at that boring accounting firm all day. It is not like you have a husband or children or a real life to spend your money on anyway. You should be grateful we are letting you contribute to a family event that actually matters. I closed the leather folder and held it out to her. I am not paying for your signature cocktails, Chloe. Find another sponsor for your wedding. Before Chloe could say another word, a sharp, agonizing pain shot through the back of my right arm. My mother Beatrice had marched over from the VIP table and grabbed me. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails dug so deeply into my tricep that I felt the skin break. You ungrateful little witch! Beatrice hissed into my ear. Her voice was dripping with venom, but her face maintained a rigid, terrifying smile for the watching guests. How dare you embarrass us in front of Chloe's family? You are a worthless burden, Kendra. You have always been a dark cloud over this family. You are ruining my perfect son's night. Pay the bill right now and apologize to your sister-in-law before I make you regret walking into this room. For 32 years, I had taken the physical pinches, the verbal lashings, and the constant reminders that I was nothing more than dirt beneath their shoes. For 32 years, I swallowed my pride to keep the holy image of Pastor Calvin and First Lady Beatrice intact. But tonight, the pain in my arm felt different. It felt like a chain finally snapping. I did not just step away. I swung my arm up and slapped my mother's hand away with a loud, sharp crack. The sound echoed over the soft classical music playing in the background. Several guests at the nearby tables gasped. Beatrice stumbled back a step, clutching her hand, her eyes wide with absolute shock. She opened her mouth to scream, but I stepped forward and raised my voice, ensuring every single wealthy church elder, corporate sponsor, and country club member in the vicinity could hear me clearly. I am not paying $15,000 for your liquor, I announced, my voice ringing with absolute authority. Do you want to know why I cannot afford to fund this ridiculous party, Beatrice? Because I already paid the $10,000 property tax for your church this month. If I had not written that check from my personal savings, the city would have foreclosed on your holy sanctuary 3 weeks ago. The ballroom went dead silent. The string quartet stopped playing. Church deacons stared at Pastor Calvin in horror, but I was not finished. I turned my gaze to Trey, who was now standing at the VIP table, looking like he had been struck by lightning. And I certainly cannot pay for Chloe's drinks, because I know I have to keep my emergency savings intact. Your golden child over there is currently hiding the fact that his supposed luxury investment firm is exactly 60 days away from Chapter 11 bankruptcy. He is drowning in private debt, and you are throwing a party like he is a king. Trey's face turned a violent shade of purple. He shoved his heavy wooden dining chair back with so much force that it crashed backward onto the marble floor. He stormed toward me, his chest puffed out, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He looked ready to physically assault me right there in the middle of the ballroom. Shut your mouth, Kendra, Trey roared, his voice cracking with panic and rage. You are a liar. You are a jealous, bitter liar. I did not flinch. I stood my ground, looking him dead in the eye. I am a forensic accountant, Trey. I see every hidden ledger, every bounced check, and every fraudulent transfer you make. We both know I am telling the exact truth. Pastor Calvin rushed over his face, dripping with sweat, grabbing Trey by the shoulders to hold him back while frantically apologizing to the staring crowd. He tried to laugh it off, calling it a silly sibling rivalry, but the damage was permanently done. The whispers had already started. The facade was cracking. I dropped the black leather billfold onto the floor right at Chloe's designer shoes. "Have a beautiful wedding," I said. I turned around, pushed open the heavy double doors, and walked out of the venue. The cool night air hit my flushed face as I stepped into the dimly lit parking lot. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely fish my keys out of my purse. I had never spoken to them like that. I had never defended myself publicly. I felt terrified and entirely liberated at the same time. I reached my old beaten-up sedan and leaned against the driver's side door, taking deep, ragged breaths to calm my racing pulse. "You threw quite a punch in there." I jumped, spinning around. Harrison Sterling, Chloe's father, stepped out from the shadows of a large oak tree near the valet station. He was wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal suit. His posture was rigid, and his expression was unreadable. He did not look angry about my outburst, which confused me. He did not offer pity or demand an apology for his daughter either. He simply looked at me with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. He walked closer, stopping a few feet away. He was holding two steaming paper cups of coffee from the country club valet stand. He held one out toward me. "You look like you need this," he said, his voice smooth and calculated. I stared at the cup, then at him. "Why are you out here, Mr. Sterling? Shouldn't you be inside comforting your daughter after I supposedly ruined her rehearsal dinner?" Harrison offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "My daughter will survive a bruised ego. I am far more interested in the woman who just dismantled a fake empire with 3 sentences. Take the coffee, Kendra. It is a cold night." My hands were still trembling, so I took the warm cup. The heat seeped into my cold fingers, bringing a small measure of comfort. I took a slow sip. It was black coffee, bitter and strong. Harrison took a sip from his own cup, watching me carefully. His eyes darted to my face again, specifically focusing on the amber splash of color in my right eye. I shifted uncomfortably under his intense scrutiny. "What was your mother's maiden name before she married the pastor?" he asked suddenly. The question was so random and cryptic that it threw me completely off guard. I frowned, staring at him over the rim of my cup. Beatrice did not have a maiden name. She was a foster child who grew up in the system. There are no records of her parents. Why do you care? Harrison's jaw tightened. He looked away, staring out at the dark parking lot for a long moment. "A foster child," he murmured softly, almost to himself. "Of course. That is how they erased her track. That is how they hid it." Hid what? I demanded, my patience wearing extremely thin. "Look, Mr. Sterling, I have had the worst night of my life, and I just want to go home. If you have something to say, please just say it." Harrison turned his gaze back to me. His eyes were no longer cold. They were filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and burning determination. "Drink your coffee, Kendra. You are going to need your strength for the days ahead." I did not understand his bizarre behavior, but the adrenaline crash was hitting me hard, and I desperately needed the caffeine. I raised the cup to my lips and drained the last of the warm, bitter liquid. I lowered the cup, preparing to toss it into a nearby trash can. Before I could move, Harrison reached out and took the empty paper cup directly from my hands. He did not throw it away. Instead, he reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag. He dropped my empty coffee cup inside the bag and sealed it shut with a swift, practiced motion. "What are you doing?" I asked, stepping back, my heart rate spiking again. Harrison slipped the plastic bag securely into his coat pocket. He looked at me with absolute certainty. "I just need to borrow this," he said. "Have a safe drive home, Kendra. Keep your doors locked tonight." Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the bright lights of the country club, leaving me standing alone in the dark parking lot, clutching my car keys and wondering what kind of dangerous game had just begun. The aggressive pounding on my apartment door started exactly at 6 in the morning. I had not slept a single minute since leaving the country club parking lot. My mind had been spinning in endless circles, replaying Harrison Sterling taking my coffee cup and asking about my mother's maiden name. The knocking grew louder, echoing through the thin walls of my hallway. I tightened the belt of my robe and walked barefoot to the door. I checked the peephole. Standing under the flickering fluorescent hallway light were Pastor Calvin and First Lady Beatrice. My parents were dressed impeccably even at the crack of dawn. Calvin wore his signature tailored suit, while Beatrice had her hair pinned back, perfectly gripping her designer handbag like a weapon. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. They did not wait for an invitation. Calvin pushed his way past me into my small living room with Beatrice marching right behind him. "You have a lot of nerve ignoring our phone calls," Kendra, my father, snapped, turning to face me. His booming voice, usually reserved for the pulpit, was now sharp and entirely lacking the holy grace he sold to his congregation. I closed the door, leaning my back against the cheap wood. "It is 6 in the morning, Calvin. I was not ignoring you. I was trying to sleep off the circus you hosted last night." Beatrice slammed a thick manila folder onto my kitchen island. The heavy sound made me flinch, but I kept my face perfectly neutral. "You owe us for the spectacle you caused," she said, her voice venomous. Chloe went back to her hotel in tears. Her wealthy family is suddenly asking questions about Trey's finances because you could not keep your jealous mouth shut. You embarrassed this family, Kendra, and now you are going to fix it. I walked slowly over to the island and looked down at the folder. I flipped open the cover. Inside was a commercial loan agreement from a private predatory lending agency. The principal amount requested was $50,000. The interest rate was absolutely astronomical. I looked back up at them, completely baffled by their audacity. "You want me to take out a $50,000 loan?" I asked, my voice dripping with disbelief. "We want you to co-sign it," Calvin corrected, adjusting his silk tie. "Trey needs the cash cleared by tomorrow morning to pay the florists, the caterers, and the remaining venue fees. The country club is threatening to cancel the reception if the balance is not zeroed out today. Since you decided to humiliate him publicly and ruin his credibility, you will put your name on this paper as the guarantor." I laughed. I actually threw my head back and laughed at the sheer insanity of the demand. "You raised him like a prince and treated me like the hired help for 32 years. You bought him a luxury condo while I scrubbed the church bathrooms just to afford community college textbooks. Now his fake investment firm is drowning, and you want me to leverage my hard-earned credit score to pay for his wedding cake. The answer is absolutely not. Go ask the church elders for a handout." Calvin stepped forward, towering over me. The polite church leader facade completely vanished, leaving behind a ruthless businessman who hated being told no. "You listen to me very carefully, Kendra," he said, his tone dangerously low. "You have built a nice little independent life for yourself here. You have your own forensic accounting firm. You have a respectable client roster. But do not ever forget who built the ground you walk on." He leaned closer, his face inches from mine. 70% of your small business clients are members of my congregation. The local hair salons, the barber shops, the soul food restaurants, they all trust you because they trust me. They bring their taxes and their payrolls to you because you are Pastor Calvin's daughter." He tapped a heavy gold ring against the kitchen counter. "If you do not sign this document today, I will stand at the pulpit on Sunday morning. I will look my congregation in the eyes and tell them that my daughter has lost her way. I will tell them you have turned to dark secular practices and can no longer be trusted with their livelihoods. I will publicly excommunicate you, Kendra. Your business will collapse in a week." A cold chill washed over my entire body. He was not bluffing. I had seen him do this before, to deacons who questioned his spending and to choir directors who asked for a raise. Calvin commanded an army of loyal followers who would pull their accounts from my firm by Monday morning if he gave the word. My business, the one thing I had built entirely on my own sweat and tears, would be utterly destroyed. Beatrice smiled, crossing her arms over her chest. It was a wicked, triumphant smile. She knew they had me cornered. "Just sign the paper, Kendra," she taunted. "It is what you are good at, cleaning up your brother's messes." I looked at the pen resting on top of the contract. My blood boiled, but my mind immediately shifted into survival mode. I could not win a screaming match against a man who manipulated thousands of people for a living. I needed to be strategic. I needed to buy time to figure out exactly how leveraged Trey was and how I could shield my business from Calvin's threats. I picked up the pen. Beatrice let out a satisfied huff of air, thinking she had broken my spirit yet again. I held the pen over the signature line but stopped. I looked up at Calvin. I am a forensic accountant, Calvin. I do not sign blind contracts from predatory lenders. If you want my signature, I need to review the terms, calculate the amortization schedule, and verify the routing numbers. I am not risking a fraud charge because Trey filled out the paperwork wrong. Calvin narrowed his eyes, weighing my words. You have 1 hour, he demanded. We will wait in the car. If this is not signed and emailed to the loan officer by 7:30, you will be packing up your office by Monday. They turned and marched out of my apartment, letting the front door slam shut behind them. The second I was alone, I threw the deadbolt. I ran to my bedroom and grabbed my laptop, bringing it back to the kitchen island. I did not waste time looking at the loan terms. I knew it was garbage. Instead, I opened my encrypted financial tracing software. It was the same proprietary software I used to track embezzled corporate funds for my highest-paying clients. I opened the loan application and found the primary guarantor account listed before my name. It was the main tithe and offering account for my parents' megachurch. Calvin was using the church's operating funds to back Trey's personal loan, but the bank required a second signature because the church account was already heavily leveraged. I typed the church's bank routing and account numbers into my software. I initiated a backdoor audit. I wanted to see exactly where all the congregation's money was going. If Calvin was going to threaten my livelihood, I was going to find the skeletons in his holy closet to use as leverage. The screen flashed as lines of data began pouring in. The church brought in massive amounts of untaxed cash every single week. But as I filtered the outgoing transfers, I noticed a massive glaring anomaly. It was not a one-time purchase or a sloppy wire transfer to Trey. It was a ghost in the machine. Every single month on the 15th day, exactly 10% of the church's total gross income was automatically funneled out of the tithe account. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding in my throat. I traced the outgoing routing number. The money was not going to a charity or a community outreach program. It was being routed through 3 different domestic shell companies deliberately designed to wash the origin of the funds. I deployed a deep trace algorithm to follow the money through the digital maze. The progress bar on my screen slowly climbed to 100%. The final destination of the laundered money flashed onto my monitor. It was an offshore trust account located in the Cayman Islands, heavily protected and entirely untaxed. I stared at the beneficiary name registered to that offshore account, and the breath completely left my lungs. The Althea Foundation. I sat back in my bar stool, my hands trembling. Althea. That was Beatrice's wild, estranged sister. Growing up, Beatrice spoke of Althea with nothing but pure disgust, calling her a sinner who chased fast money and dangerous men. According to the family story, Althea died completely broke in a tragic car accident over 30 years ago, with no husband and no children to her name. I stared at the glowing screen. Millions of dollars had been secretly funneled from my parents' church into a foundation named after a dead woman. Why was Pastor Calvin sending a massive fortune to a ghost? And why did Harrison Sterling Chloe's wealthy father suddenly ask me about my mother's maiden name while stealing my DNA? The pieces of a massive, terrifying puzzle were scattered across my kitchen island. I grabbed my cell phone and took a photo of the offshore routing numbers. Calvin thought he had me backed into a corner, but he had just handed me the keys to his destruction. I sat at my mahogany desk, staring at the printed screenshot of the offshore routing numbers. My coffee had gone completely cold, but my blood was boiling. I had barely digested the fact that Pastor Calvin was funneling church money into a dead woman's foundation when the heavy glass door of my accounting firm swung open. Harrison Sterling stepped into my office. He did not ask for permission. He turned around, pushed the deadbolt until it clicked loudly, and reached over to twist the window blinds completely shut. "What are you doing here, Mr. Sterling?" I asked, standing up and sliding the offshore printout under a tax ledger. "If you are here to demand an apology for last night, you are wasting your time." He did not look angry. He looked like a man who had just uncovered a bomb and was trying to figure out how to defuse it. He walked over to the leather visitor chair and dropped a thick, dusty file onto my desk. The heavy thud made me jump. I am not here as Chloe's father, Kendra, he said, his voice smooth and deadly serious. I am here as a retired estate attorney. More specifically, I am here as the former legal counsel for Althea Vance. The name hung in the tense air between us. I shook my head, gripping the edge of my desk. Althea was my mother's sister. She died 30 years ago in a car wreck, completely broke. Beatrice uses her as a cautionary tale every Sunday to scare the church youth group about the dangers of chasing fast money. Harrison let out a harsh, bitter laugh that contained absolutely no humor. Beatrice is a phenomenal liar. Althea did not die broke. She was one of the sharpest commercial real estate investors in Chicago. By the time she was 28, she had built an empire, and she certainly did not die childless. He leaned across my desk, his eyes locking onto mine with terrifying intensity. He stared directly at the right side of my face, focusing entirely on the vibrant amber splash of color near my pupil. Althea had a very specific genetic mutation, he said, his voice dropping to a low whisper. Central heterochromia. It is incredibly rare. She had the exact same amber splash in her right eye that you have right now. A sickening wave of nausea washed over me, hitting me so hard my knees actually buckled. I sank slowly back into my desk chair. My entire life, Beatrice had treated my right eye like a disgusting deformity. Whenever I dared to ask for a new dress or a chance to attend a high school dance, she would grab my chin, force my face toward a mirror, and point at that amber splash. She called it the mark of a stubborn child. She told me it was a physical sign of my inherent sin, and that serving Trey cleaning his room and cooking his meals was the only way to cleanse my spirit. She weaponized my own face to keep my self-esteem buried in the dirt. She made me hate the only piece of my true mother I had left. You are telling me Beatrice hated my eye because it belonged to her sister? I asked, my voice vibrating with a rage so deep it scared me. I am telling you, Beatrice hated your eye because it was a constant daily reminder of the woman whose fortune she stole, Harrison replied. 30 years ago, Althea died in a suspicious accident just weeks after giving birth. Beatrice and Calvin were the only family she had. They stepped in to handle the funeral and the baby. They told me the infant passed away from complications shortly after Althea died. I was a young lawyer back then, and Calvin was a charismatic preacher. I believed them. I finalized the transfer of Althea's assets to Calvin's ministry exactly as he requested. I looked at the dusty file on my desk. The pieces of the puzzle were slamming together with violent force. The offshore trust, the $50,000 loan demand, the constant financial drain. They did not just hide my identity. They used me as a free servant while they lived like kings on my mother's money. Why are you telling me this now? I demanded, looking up at him. Why wait 30 years to start asking questions? Because of last night, Harrison said, gripping the back of the chair. When you stood in that ballroom and publicly declared that Trey's investment firm was 60 days away from bankruptcy, you confirmed my worst suspicions. My daughter Chloe is blinded by love and status. She refused to listen when I warned her that Trey was hiding his financials. But when I saw your face under that chandelier, when I saw Althea staring back at me from the face of the woman Beatrice treats like a stray dog, I knew I had to act. Harrison reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a crisp white envelope with a premium medical laboratory logo stamped in the corner. I have spent the last 12 hours making very expensive phone calls, he said. I paid a private laboratory triple their usual rate to rush the swab I took from your coffee cup last night. I needed to cross-reference your DNA with the medical records I have kept sealed in Althea's file for 3 decades. I had to know for sure before I let my daughter marry into a family of absolute monsters. He slid the piece of paper across my smooth mahogany desk. The paper glided over the polished wood and stopped right over the hidden printout of the offshore bank accounts. I looked down at the bold black letters printed on the official lab report. The words blurred for a second before snapping into sharp, terrifying focus. The report declared a 99.9% genetic match. The lab rushed the results, Harrison said, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of a 30-year lie. You are not Beatrice's daughter, Kendra. You are her niece, and you are the sole living heir to a $45 million estate. I stared at the laboratory report resting on my mahogany desk. The bold black numbers 99.9% genetic match burned themselves into my retinas. Any other woman might have collapsed into a puddle of tears or screamed at the ceiling. I did neither. I did not cry because tears were a currency Beatrice and Calvin had stripped from me decades ago. I am a forensic accountant. My entire career is built on the cold hard reality of numbers and paper trails. The DNA test was the biological truth, but I needed the financial proof. Harrison Sterling had given me the key to the vault, but I needed the actual ledger to burn my fake parents to the ground. Calvin was a narcissist of the highest order. Narcissists do not destroy their greatest victories. They keep trophies. I knew exactly where Calvin kept his. I waited until 7 o'clock that evening. Wednesday night Bible study at Greater Faith Ministries was practically a mandatory event for anyone who wanted to maintain their social standing in our community. The sprawling megachurch campus was packed with luxury vehicles. Calvin would be standing at his custom acrylic pulpit, wearing a tailored suit, delivering a sermon about honesty and tithing. Beatrice would be in the front pew, dripping in diamonds purchased with my dead mother's money, playing the role of the devout First Lady. I parked my old sedan 3 blocks away and walked to the campus under the cover of darkness. I did not use the grand front doors. I slipped around to the rear loading dock. For 10 years before I started my own firm, I was the unpaid janitor and basic bookkeeper for this massive building. I knew the security blind spots better than the hired guards. I punched a 5-digit override code into the service keypad. A code Calvin thought he had deactivated years ago, but I had secretly hardwired into the backup system. The heavy metal door clicked open and I slipped inside. The booming sound of the gospel choir vibrated through the floorboards as I moved quietly through the dimly lit service corridors. I bypassed the opulent marble-floored administrative suites on the second level and headed straight for the restricted third floor, the church attic. This space was strictly off-limits to everyone except Calvin and his most trusted elders. It housed decades of financial archives, sealed architectural blueprints, and the foundational documents of Greater Faith Ministries. The air up here was thick with dust and the smell of aging paper. There were no security cameras on this floor because Calvin did not want digital eyes watching him when he handled his private ledgers. I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and navigated through the maze of towering filing cabinets. The floorboards creaked under my weight. I was making my way toward the back corner where Calvin kept his personal lockboxes when the heavy steel door at the top of the stairwell suddenly groaned open. Heavy footsteps echoed onto the wooden floor. I froze instantly, cutting my flashlight. I pressed my back flat against a row of cold steel cabinets. Peeking through a narrow gap between the shelves, I saw the sweeping beam of a heavy-duty flashlight cutting through the darkness. It was Deacon Wallace. He was Calvin's right-hand enforcer, a towering man who handled the church's aggressive collection tactics and intimidated local business owners into making mandatory donations. He was the same man who used to sneer at me when I wore oversized hand-me-down dresses to Sunday service, while Trey paraded around in custom-tailored suits. Deacon Wallace walked slowly down the center aisle, checking the padlocks on the primary financial cabinets. His heavy boots thumped like a heartbeat against the wood. I held my breath, pressing my hand over my mouth to muffle the sound of my own breathing. The dust in the air tickled my nose, threatening to force a sneeze that would completely ruin my life. I bit hard into the inside of my cheek, using the sharp metallic taste of blood to suppress the urge. He stopped just 10 feet away from my hiding spot. He shined his flashlight directly at the gap where I was standing. The beam illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air mere inches from my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing to bolt toward the fire escape. Then his radio crackled loudly. The security feed from the sanctuary echoed through the attic, requesting Deacon Wallace to report to the lobby for a parking dispute. He grunted in annoyance, clipped his flashlight back onto his belt, and turned around. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, and the deadbolt clicked loudly, locking from the outside. He had just locked me in the attic. I was trapped, but I was also guaranteed absolute, uninterrupted privacy. I exhaled a long, shaky breath and turned my flashlight back on. I moved rapidly to the very back of the room, where the ceiling sloped low. Hidden behind a stack of rotting boxes filled with old sermon cassette tapes was a heavy rusted iron lockbox. It was pushed flush against the brick wall, completely out of sight. I knelt on the dusty floorboards and pulled the heavy box toward me. It was secured with the thick vintage brass padlock. Calvin thought brute force was enough to protect his secrets. He forgot that I spent my teenage years fixing every broken piece of equipment in this building. I pulled a sturdy metal tension wrench and a modified hairpin from my pocket tools I used to access locked filing cabinets when the church staff inevitably lost their keys. I slid the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applying steady pressure. I used the hairpin to rake the pins inside the brass cylinder. 1, 2, 3, 4. The heavy padlock popped open with a loud metallic clank. I pulled the padlock free and threw open the rusted lid. The stale smell of 30-year-old secrets hit my face. The box was not filled with cash or gold. It was filled with manila folders bound by brittle rubber bands. I pulled out the first folder and opened it, laying the documents flat on the dusty floorboards under the beam of my flashlight. My hands started to tremble as I stared at the first piece of paper. It was a birth certificate. The state seal of Illinois was stamped at the top. The date of birth was my exact birthday. But the mother listed on the official state document was Beatrice Jenkins. The father was Calvin Jenkins. It was a masterfully forged document created long before digital records made such deception nearly impossible. I pushed it aside and grabbed the next document. It was printed on the thick, textured paper of the county coroner's office. A death certificate. I read the name at the top of the page. Baby girl Vance. Althea's maiden name. The date of death was listed exactly 2 days after my actual birthday. The cause of death was recorded as sudden infant death syndrome. A cold, hard knot formed in my chest. They did not just take me in. They legally erased me. Beatrice and Calvin declared Althea's newborn baby dead to the state. They buried an empty casket or a stolen body just to close the legal loop on Althea's bloodline. Then they forged a brand new birth certificate and claimed me as their own unexpected miracle child. They bound me to them legally and entirely, so no one would ever come looking for the missing Vance heir. I dug deeper into the lockbox, tossing aside old tax returns and property deeds until I reached the very bottom. There, resting in a clear plastic sleeve, was a piece of yellow dot matrix printer paper. The ink was faded, but the numbers were unmistakable. It was a bank transfer receipt from a major international holding bank, dated exactly 3 weeks after the fake death certificate was issued. I traced my finger over the faded type. The sender account belonged to the estate of Althea Vance. The receiving account was listed as the Greater Faith Ministry Building Fund, an account solely controlled by Pastor Calvin. I looked at the amount transferred, $45 million. Every single Sunday, Beatrice stood at the altar and preached about how God had miraculously provided the funds to build this massive megachurch campus. They told the congregation it was a blessing rained down upon them for their faithful service. They told me that I was a financial burden preventing them from buying me new shoes or paying for my education. They built their entire holy empire, their luxury cars, Trey's Ivy League education, and this very building on the bones of my dead mother. They raised the sole heir to a $45 million fortune as an unpaid maid to keep my self-worth so low I would never dare to look up from the floor. I carefully folded the forged birth certificate, the fake death certificate, and the $45 million wire transfer receipt. I slid them securely into the inside pocket of my jacket. I closed the rusted lockbox, snapped the brass padlock back into place, and shoved it exactly where I found it behind the old cassettes. I did not feel shock anymore. The betrayal had burned away every last ounce of fear, leaving nothing but cold, calculated vengeance. I stood up in the dark, dusty attic of the church that my stolen money had built. I pulled out my phone, the screen illuminating the dark space. I was not just going to stop Trey's wedding. I was going to tear down this entire congregation and bury Pastor Calvin and First Lady Beatrice under the rubble of their own lies. I bypassed the locked stairwell door by unscrewing the grate to the ventilation shaft, just like I used to do when I needed to escape Beatrice's endless cleaning assignments. I slid through the narrow metal duct, dropping quietly onto the carpet of a dark hallway on the second floor. I walked straight out the back doors of the church and into the cool night air. I dialed a phone number I had memorized years ago. The line rang twice before a deep, sharp voice answered. "I need the war room," I said, my voice harder than concrete. "Cancel your morning court appearances. We are taking down the biggest fraud in the state." I walked away from the heavy brick building of Greater Faith Ministries, leaving the ventilation grate resting quietly in the bushes. The night air was sharp against my face, but I felt absolutely nothing. The documents burning a hole in my jacket pocket were heavier than concrete. I reached my old sedan, slammed the door shut, and locked out the rest of the world. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had kept memorized for 3 years. The line rang twice before Malik answered. Malik was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in downtown Chicago. He wore bespoke suits, drove a bulletproof vehicle, and destroyed massive corporations for a living. 3 years ago, he was representing a high-profile client in a billion-dollar divorce. The opposing side had buried the marital assets so deep that a team of federal auditors missed them. I found the hidden money in 48 hours, using a tracing algorithm I built entirely from scratch. Malik won his impossible case and secured his name on the wall of his firm. He told me that if I ever needed a body buried or a bank broken, to make the call. "I need the war room," I said, my voice harder than steel. "Cancel your morning court appearances. We are taking down the biggest fraud in the state." He did not ask for details. He heard the ice in my tone and immediately gave me the access code to his private garage. 20 minutes later, I walked into his corner office on the 50th floor. The room was surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the glittering city skyline. Malik was standing by a massive digital interactive whiteboard, wearing a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked ready for a fight. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I walked straight to his long glass conference table and threw down the rusted treasures I had stolen from Calvin's lockbox. I spread out the forged birth certificate, the fake death certificate, and the faded bank transfer receipt for $45 million. Malik leaned over this table, his dark eyes scanning the documents. For a man who regularly dealt with corporate sociopaths and corrupt politicians, I actually saw his jaw drop. Forging state birth records, faking an infant death, and laundering $45 million through a tax-exempt religious institution. He looked up at me with sheer disbelief. "This is not just white-collar crime, Kendra. This is a masterpiece of pure evil." We went to work. For the next 5 hours, Malik and I turned that corner office into a tactical command center. He pulled up state registries, property deeds, and offshore banking networks, while I ran the raw numbers through my forensic tracing software. We tore through 3 decades of Pastor Calvin and First Lady Beatrice's financial history. We watched the digital footprint of my stolen inheritance weave through the church's tax-exempt status like a venomous snake. Calvin had used the ministry as an impenetrable shield. He claimed the 45 million was a series of anonymous divine donations bestowed upon the church over the years. He laundered my dead mother's fortune through the church building fund and then legally transferred it into his private offshore accounts using pastoral housing allowances, executive compensation loopholes, and fake charity outreach programs. As the spreadsheets populated on the giant monitor, the true horror of my existence finally clicked into place. It hit me with the force of a speeding freight train. My entire life was a carefully constructed psychological cage. I thought about being 12 years old. I remembered watching Trey unwrap a brand new luxury laptop for his birthday. When I asked for a simple notebook for school, Beatrice handed me a mop and a bucket of heavy bleach. She told me that I was an unexpected financial burden on the family and that hard physical labor was the only way to earn my keep. They made me scrub the church toilets, cook their extravagant meals, and wear ragged hand-me-down clothes. I remembered standing in the kitchen watching Trey eat premium steak while I was told to scrape together a meal from the leftovers. Beatrice would look at me with cold, dead eyes and say that some children are just born to serve. It was never about discipline. It was about systematic mental destruction. They needed to keep my self-esteem buried so deeply in the dirt that I would never dare to look up from the floor. They needed me to believe I was a worthless charity case, so I would never ask questions about my true origins. They turned the sole heir to a massive empire into their personal maid, hiding their greatest crime right in the middle of their own living room. They stole my mother, my identity, and my future to fund their holy charade. A heavy silence fell over the office. Malik looked at me from across the table, his eyes reflecting the harsh blue light of the monitors. He did not offer me a tissue or a sympathetic hug. He knew me better than that. He knew I wanted blood, not pity. He cracked his knuckles and walked back to his keyboard. If Pastor Calvin is sitting on a $45 million offshore fortune, Malik said, his fingers flying across the keys. Why the hell did Trey show up at your apartment at dawn demanding you co-sign a $50,000 loan? That does not make any logical sense. If the golden boy needed cash to pay for his country club wedding, Calvin could have easily wired it from his hidden accounts. I stood up and walked over to the monitors. You are exactly right. Calvin protects Trey at all costs. If Trey is borrowing from predatory lenders, it means Calvin either cut him off or Calvin's stolen money is currently tied up in non-liquid assets. Pull up Trey's investment firm, I instructed. Let us see what the golden child is actually doing with his perfect life. Malik hacked into the public filings for Trey's company and then used a backdoor entry I provided to access his shadow ledgers. A cascade of red numbers flooded the screen. Trey was not just broke, he was drowning in a financial bloodbath. His luxury investment firm was an absolute shell company. He had burned through millions in terrible commercial real estate investments and an outrageously extravagant lifestyle. He was leasing sports cars, renting penthouses, and throwing cash around to look like a self-made mogul. But the bank loans were not the worst part. Malik isolated a series of massive hidden liabilities routed through untraceable wire transfers. Trey owed $2 million to a network of highly dangerous private lenders. These were not corporate banks or friendly investors. These were street-level loan sharks operating behind corporate fronts. The kind of lenders who break bones, burn down businesses, and terrorize families when they do not get their monthly payments. Trey was completely trapped. I stared at the screen as the horrific truth of tomorrow's wedding crystallized in my mind. This is not a marriage, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. This is a heist. I pointed at the screen. Chloe's family is old money. Her father, Harrison Sterling, is a retired attorney worth tens of millions. I tapped the upcoming transaction requests pending on Trey's accounts. Trey is forcing this wedding to happen because he needs legal access to Chloe's marital assets. He has already drafted the routing numbers. The second they say I do and the marriage certificate is signed, Trey plans to siphon Chloe's family wealth and transfer it directly offshore. Malik zoomed in on the destination accounts. He is going to use the exact same stolen trust infrastructure that Calvin built for your inheritance to hide Chloe's money from her father, Malik realized, shaking his head in disgust. It is a perfect pipeline for money laundering, and Trey already has the keys. The desperation of the morning made perfect sense now. Trey needed that $50,000 loan to ensure the wedding happened. If the caterers or the venue canceled, he would not get a marriage certificate. If he did not get the marriage certificate, he could not drain Chloe's accounts. And if he did not get her money offshore to pay back his debts, those private lenders were going to destroy him. His actual life depended on marrying Chloe tomorrow. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and looked at the time. It was 3 in the morning. The bridal luncheon was scheduled for noon. The golden child thought he had everything under control. He thought he could use me as a financial shield, just like his parents used me as a servant. But Trey did not realize that the broken maid he tormented for 30 years now held the detonator to his entire existence. Print every single ledger, Malik, I commanded, stepping away from the monitors. Print the offshore accounts, the forged birth certificates, and the loan shark debts. Put them in a secure binder. Malik hit the print command, a lethal smile spreading across his face. What is the plan, Kendra? I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. I am going to crash a bridal luncheon. It is time to let the bride know exactly what kind of monster she is marrying. The Carlton Hotel tea room smelled of imported lavender and forced civility. I walked past the velvet ropes, ignoring the hostess who tried to stop me, and stepped right into the sunlit atrium. Chloe's exclusive bridal luncheon was in full swing, occupying the grand center table. 20 women dressed in pastel silk were sipping Earl Grey tea from gold-rimmed porcelain cups. My mother Beatrice sat at the head of the table, wearing a custom-tailored ivory suit looking like the queen of a kingdom she built on my stolen inheritance. I did not wear pastel. I wore a razor-sharp crimson pantsuit that Malik had his assistant purchase for me a few hours earlier. When my heels clicked against the marble floor, the lively chatter at the grand table immediately died down. Chloe spotted me first. Her perfectly glossed lips tightened into a thin, hard line. She leaned over and whispered something to Beatrice, whose head snapped in my direction. The fake holy smile melted right off my mother's face. I walked straight toward them, maintaining absolute eye contact. Before I could pull out, Beatrice shot up from her seat. She grabbed my arm with that familiar iron grip and physically steered me away from the wealthy bridesmaids and Chloe's affluent family members. She pushed me toward a tiny cramped table shoved right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen, where the waitstaff rushed back and forth with dirty dishes. "You have some nerve showing your face here," Beatrice hissed, keeping her voice low so the country club wives would not hear her venom. "You caused a scene at the rehearsal dinner. You refused to sign your brother's loan this morning, and now you crash a private high tea uninvited. Sit at this table and keep your mouth shut, Kendra. You do not belong with the honored guests." I looked at the tiny table tucked in the shadows. For my entire life, Beatrice had made me eat my Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners at a folding table in the kitchen, while Trey sat in the formal dining room with the church elders. She conditioned me to believe my presence was an embarrassing stain on her pristine image. I used to cry over that exclusion. Today I simply pulled out the chair and sat down, crossing my legs with total composure. Chloe strutted over a few minutes later, leaving her wealthy friends behind to come gloat. She stood over my small table, looking down her nose at me. She swirled the champagne in her crystal flute. "I am honestly surprised you showed up, Kendra." Chloe mocked, her voice dripping with condescension. "You do not even have a +1 for the wedding tomorrow. But I guess it makes sense. It is hard to find a man when you spend all your time being miserable and trying to ruin your brother's happiness. Trey told me you threw a massive tantrum this morning because you are jealous of his success." I did not take the bait. I simply smiled up at her and took a slow sip of ice water. "Trey's success is definitely something to marvel at, Chloe," I replied smoothly. "I hope you enjoy every single penny of it." Chloe narrowed her eyes, trying to figure out if I was insulting her, but her arrogance quickly won out. She slapped a heavy black leather billfold onto my tiny table right over my water glass. "Since you decided to crash my private luncheon, you can finally make yourself useful," Chloe demanded, crossing her arms. "The venue requires immediate settlement for reserving the atrium. The total is $5,000. Consider this your official apology for your disgusting attitude at my rehearsal dinner last night. Pay the bill, Kendra, or I will have security escort you out in front of all my friends." Beatrice stood right beside Chloe, nodding in agreement. "It is the least you can do after threatening to abandon your family," Beatrice added, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "Pay the bill right now. Prove you are not completely useless to us." I looked down at the leather billfold. $5,000 for finger sandwiches and tea. I knew exactly what was happening. Trey was drowning in $2 million of loan shark debt, and his credit cards were completely maxed out. He could not afford to pay for his bride's extravagant luncheon, so he had undoubtedly manipulated Chloe into forcing me to foot the bill. They thought they were punishing me. They thought they were putting the disobedient servant back in her place. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or try to defend my financial boundaries like I used to do. I simply reached into my crimson designer handbag. Malik had worked a miracle at the bank that morning. Using the emergency injunction and the verified DNA results, he had successfully unfrozen a tiny fraction of my reclaimed Althea trust, just enough to issue me a temporary corporate account. I pulled out a sleek, solid metal black card. It had no spending limit and my actual legal name engraved on the front. I tossed it onto the table. The heavy metal hit the wood with a loud, solid thud that made both Beatrice and Chloe jump. "Put it all on that," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "And please make sure to tip the waitstaff an extra 20%. They work incredibly hard while other people sit around demanding free handouts." Beatrice stared at the black card. The blood completely drained from her face. As a woman obsessed with wealth and status, she knew exactly what kind of financial leverage was required to hold a solid metal centurion card. She knew a local forensic accountant servicing small businesses did not carry one. Her eyes darted from the card to my face, panic briefly flashing in her pupils. "Where did you get this?" Beatrice demanded, her voice trembling slightly. "Whose name is on this account, Kendra?" I picked up my water glass and took another slow sip, enjoying the absolute terror radiating from my mother. "It is mine, Beatrice," I smiled. "I just landed a massive corporate client this morning. The kind of client who pays their retainers in advance and cleans out decades of garbage. My firm is doing incredibly well. You really should not worry about my finances anymore." Chloe looked confused by Beatrice's sudden panic, but she greedily snatched the black card off the table. "Well, it is about time you contributed something," she sneered, turning on her heel and marching toward the venue manager to process the payment. Beatrice stayed rooted to the spot, staring at me like I had suddenly turned into a dangerous predator. She opened her mouth to interrogate me further, but I stood up abruptly, brushing a non-existent speck of dust from my jacket. "Enjoy the tea, Beatrice," I said, grabbing my handbag. "I have a very busy schedule today. Weddings require so much careful preparation, do they not?" I walked past her, leaving her standing alone by the kitchen doors. I moved purposefully toward the grand table where Chloe had just returned from the payment terminal. Chloe dropped my black card back into my hand, looking victorious. I opened my bag to put the card away. Tucked perfectly at the top of my purse was a piece of paper Malik had meticulously forged for me 2 hours ago. It was designed to look exactly like an official IRS asset freeze notice. The document had Trey's full legal name printed in bold black ink right at the top, along with terrifying legal warnings about criminal tax evasion and immediate asset seizure. As I slipped my black card into my bag, I deliberately bumped my hip against the edge of the grand table. I allowed my purse to tip just enough. The forged IRS document slid out silently and drifted down to the floor, landing perfectly underneath the strap of Chloe's expensive white handbag. I did not stop. I did not look back. I walked straight out of the sunlit atrium, leaving the document waiting like a ticking time bomb. Chloe was a woman obsessed with wealth and security. The second she picked up her purse, she would see Trey's name plastered next to the letters IRS. The seed of absolute paranoia was firmly planted, and the Golden Boy's entire fake empire was about to catch fire. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung shut behind me, cutting off the suffocating air of the private dining room, but the quiet of the valet parking lot lasted only a fraction of a second. Heavy, uneven footsteps echoed against the concrete behind me. Rubber soles skidded frantically across the asphalt. I did not bother to slow down or look back. I knew the sound of desperate rage before it even found its voice. "Stop right there!" Trey's voice cracked sharp and breathless. I kept walking toward my vehicle, my heels clicking a steady, unbothered rhythm against the pavement. That calm indifference only drove him deeper into his hysteria. I said, "Stop, damn it!" A hand grabbed my shoulder from behind, yanking me around with enough force to pull a lesser woman off balance. I planted my heel, absorbed the momentum, and faced him. Trey was a pathetic sight. Sweat rolled down the sides of his face, dampening the collar of his tailored suit. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, and his eyes wild with a mixture of terror and unbridled fury. The arrogant composure he had worn at the luncheon table was entirely shattered. The black card I had used to settle the $30,000 bill had done more than just pay for a meal. It had completely dismantled the illusion of superiority he had spent years building over me. "Where did you get that card?" he hissed, stepping directly into my personal space. His chest heaved as he struggled for breath. "Answer me. Where did a disgraced broke outcast like you get a black card with an unlimited line of credit?" I looked at him, my expression unyielding. "It is none of your business, Trey. Now get your hand off me." "It is my business," he roared, his voice bouncing off the parked luxury sedans around us. "You embarrassed me in front of the entire family. You sat there and acted like you were better than everyone else. You think you can just show up after all these years, throw money around, and make a fool out of me. You made a fool out of yourself the moment you handed me that bill, thinking you could break me," I said coldly. "You wanted to humiliate me. You wanted me to drop to my knees and beg you for help. Instead, you found out that I do not need a single penny from you or anyone else in that room." His face flushed a deep, ugly red. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles jumped under his skin. "You stole it, or you are sleeping with some rich old man who gives you an allowance. There is no other explanation. A girl like you does not just handle that kind of money." "Believe whatever comforting lie helps you sleep at night," I replied, turning my back on him to continue toward my car. "Now step aside." That was the breaking point. Trey lost whatever tiny shred of control he had left. "Give me that bag!" he screamed. He lunged forward, grabbing the leather strap of my purse with both hands, trying to wrench it off my shoulder. He pulled with all his weight, expecting me to stumble, to cry out, or to yield. He forgot who he was dealing with. I did not scream. I did not hesitate. The moment his fingers locked around the leather, my hand shot up, clamping around his right wrist like a steel vise. Before he could process what was happening, I stepped inside his guard, drove my hip into his frame, and twisted his arm outward and down, leveraging his momentum against him. Trey let out a sharp, pathetic gasp as his elbow locked. Pain shot up his arm, forcing him down onto one knee, right there on the rough pavement. The leather strap slipped harmlessly from his grasp. "Let go! You are breaking my wrist!" he yelled, his voice rising to a high-pitched squeal. I leaned in close, maintaining the joint lock, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that cut right through his panic. "Did you forget who I am, Trey? While you were spending your 20s getting manicures, driving the sports cars father bought you, and sitting in air-conditioned offices pretending to work, I was out in the real world. I spent 5 years hauling heavy equipment, moving raw lumber, and working 18-hour shifts in freezing warehouses just to keep a roof over my head." I tightened my grip just enough to make him wince, forcing his wrist a fraction of an inch further back. "My hands have calluses from real labor. Yours are soft because you have never worked a single hard day in your entire life. Do not ever put your hands on me again, because I promise you I will break them." I released his wrist with a sharp shove. Trey collapsed onto his side, cradling his hand to his chest, panting heavily as he glared up at me with absolute hatred, mixed with newfound fear. "You are crazy," he wheezed, pushing himself up into a sitting position on the hot asphalt. "You are completely insane. You think having a little money makes you untouchable. You are drowning in debt, Trey. Not me. I know about the unpaid loans. I know about the margin calls on your failed investments. You are one bad week away from total ruin, and yet you stand here acting like a king." Trey's eyes widened in genuine shock. How do you know about that?" "Because I make it my business to know everything about the people who try to destroy me," I said, looking down at him with utter disdain. He scrambled to his feet, trying desperately to regain some semblance of dignity, though his suit was now covered in dust from the parking lot ground. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. "I do not care what kind of games you are playing," he shouted, his voice shaking with humiliation. "I will find out where that money came from. I will call the police. I will tell everyone in the family that you assaulted me." Before I could even offer a response, the deep, heavy thud of a luxury SUV door shutting echoed across the parking lot. A sleek black vehicle with heavily tinted windows was parked just 3 spaces away. From the rear passenger door stepped Harrison. He was impeccably dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit, his silver hair neatly styled, holding a thick leather document folder in his hand. Behind him, 2 towering men in dark tailored suits stepped out from the front seats. Their presence was immediate, quiet, and intensely imposing. They took up positions slightly behind Harrison, their eyes scanning the lot with practiced efficiency. Trey froze, his finger still pointed in the air, his mouth half open. Harrison walked forward with slow, deliberate steps. The sound of his polished shoes against the pavement was the only sound in the quiet lot. He completely ignored Trey at first, stopping right next to me and offering a respectful, formal nod. "Are you all right?" Harrison asked me, his tone smooth, professional, and entirely calm. "I am fine, Harrison," I replied smoothly, adjusting the strap of my purse. "Just dealing with a minor nuisance." Harrison turned his head slightly, his sharp, calculating gaze finally falling upon Trey. The warmth in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a cold legal authority that sent an immediate chill through the air. "Take your hands off my client's daughter," Harrison said, his voice quiet, yet carrying a weight that commanded absolute obedience. Trey blinked his brain, clearly struggling to process the scene unfolding before him. He looked at Harrison, then at the two massive security guards standing behind him, and finally back at me. "Client's daughter." Trey stammered, his arrogance completely evaporating into sheer confusion. "What are you talking about? Who the hell are you?" Harrison did not answer the question. He did not owe Trey an explanation, and he knew it. Instead, he unbuttoned the top button of his suit jacket and gestured toward the open door of the black SUV. "The vehicle is waiting," Harrison said softly to me, completely shutting Trey out of the conversation. "We have the final documents ready for your review before the board meeting tomorrow morning." I looked at Trey one last time. His face was pale, his mouth slightly agape as the sheer impossibility of the situation began to settle into his mind. He was looking for answers, looking for a way to regain control, but the wall standing between us was now far too high for him to reach over. "Thank you, Harrison," I said calmly. I turned away from my brother, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the empty parking lot, surrounded by dust and his own crumbling ego. I walked toward the SUV, stepped inside, and listened as the heavy door sealed shut, cutting off the outside world completely. Exactly 24 hours before Trey was scheduled to walk down the aisle, felt like the deep, suffocating calm before a massive hurricane. Greater Faith Ministries hosted a mandatory prayer vigil for the golden couple, and the sanctuary was packed to the brim with 300 devout members of the congregation. Pastor Calvin stood at his custom acrylic pulpit, sweating heavily under the theatrical lighting, as he delivered a booming sermon about the sanctity of marriage and the divine blessing of generational wealth. It was a spectacular performance of absolute hypocrisy. I stood in the back of the fellowship hall, wearing a modest beige dress, completely blending into the wallpaper. I was playing the exact role they had assigned me decades ago. I poured ice-cold sweet tea into plastic cups and handed out paper plates of pound cake to the senior church elders. I kept my eyes lowered and my expression entirely submissive. No one looking at me pouring drinks would ever guess I possessed the DNA test results proving I was the rightful heir to the $45 million empire funding this entire charade. Trey sat in the front pew next to Chloe, looking like a man marching toward the executioner block. His tailored tuxedo hung slightly loose on his frame, and his right knee bounced uncontrollably against the heavy wooden pew. He kept shooting terrified glances over his shoulder, scanning the room. He was looking for me. The parking lot altercation with Harrison Sterling had completely shattered his arrogant facade. He knew I had powerful allies now, but he had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went or how much of his financial bloodbath I had uncovered. I caught his eye from across the enormous room and offered a soft, pleasant smile. He quickly looked away, wiping sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. He was drowning in $2 million of loan shark debt, and the pressure was visibly eating him alive. As the choir began their final booming hymn, my mother Beatrice suddenly appeared beside the refreshment table. She did not say a word to me. She simply grabbed my elbow with a familiar vicious grip and yanked me down the thick carpeted hallway toward the private pastoral rectory. She shoved me inside, slammed the heavy oak door shut behind us, and locked the deadbolt. The Holy Mother persona she wore for the congregation vanished instantly, replaced by the ruthless extortionist I knew so well. The rectory was dripping in opulence paid for by my stolen inheritance. Velvet chairs, gold-leafed crosses, and a massive mahogany desk dominated the room. Beatrice marched over to that desk and slapped a stack of legal documents onto the polished wood. "You have pushed your luck far enough this week, Kendra," she hissed, her eyes narrowing into dark slits. "You disrespected Chloe, you caused a scene at the rehearsal dinner, and you have been acting like you run this family. But tonight, you are going to make yourself useful and secure your brother's future." I looked down at the documents. It was a quitclaim deed. She had pre-filled all the paperwork to transfer the ownership of my small two-bedroom townhouse directly into Trey's name. I bought that townhouse 5 years ago by working 80-hour weeks, balancing my accounting firm during the day and doing freelance tax audits at night. It was the only physical asset I owned free and clear, and the only place where I felt safe. "What is this, Beatrice?" I asked, keeping my voice trembling just enough to make her think I was terrified. Trey ran into a minor administrative snag with his bank. Beatrice lied smoothly, adjusting her expensive diamond necklace. Chloe's father is a very traditional man. He expects his future son-in-law to bring tangible real estate assets into the marriage portfolio. Trey needs your townhouse on his balance sheet by tomorrow morning to satisfy the Sterling family attorneys. You will sign this deed over to him right now so he can present it before the ceremony. You expect me to give up my home so Trey can look rich for his father-in-law? I asked, wrapping my arms around myself to play the victim perfectly. Beatrice slammed her hand on the desk, making the expensive pens rattle. You will sign it because everything you have is a result of the grace Pastor Calvin and I provided you. We put a roof over your head when you were a miserable little orphan, and we allowed your accounting business to service our congregation. If you do not sign that paper right now, Calvin will stand at the pulpit on Sunday and destroy your professional reputation. We will bankrupt your firm by Monday, and you will lose that townhouse to the bank anyway. Sign the paper, Kendra, and remember your place as a servant to this family. For 32 years, Beatrice had used fear and intimidation to extract my compliance. She expected me to cry right then and there. She expected me to beg for mercy or argue about how unfair it was to take the only thing I had ever earned. She expected a fight because a fight meant she had the power, and she loved feeling powerful. Instead, I reached across the desk and picked up the heavy gold pen resting next to the inkwell. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at the signature line on the quitclaim deed. What Beatrice did not know was that 12 hours ago, I sat in a secure corporate conference room with Malik. We knew Calvin and Beatrice would try one final desperate move to secure hard assets for Trey before the wedding, because the loan sharks were closing in fast. So Malik drafted a highly specialized irrevocable trust document tying my townhouse directly to the newly activated offshore accounts. We filed the transfer electronically with the county clerk at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. Legally speaking, the townhouse did not belong to Kendra, the subservient daughter, anymore. It belonged to a heavily guarded corporate entity that required a federal judge's signature to even view the operating agreement. The piece of paper sitting on the rectory desk was referencing a property title status that simply no longer existed in the state database. I clicked the pen. I leaned over the mahogany desk and signed my full legal name in smooth flowing cursive at the bottom of the deed. I capped the pen and placed it neatly beside the paper. Beatrice snatched the document off the desk with greedy lightning speed. A vicious, triumphant smile stretched across her face. She practically purred as she checked the signature to make sure I had not forged it. Good girl, Beatrice mocked, patting my cheek with a cold, manicured hand. See how much easier things are when you just do what you are told. Now go back out to the fellowship hall and finish cleaning up the garbage from the reception. And do not even think about showing your face at the wedding ceremony tomorrow. We have already arranged for private security to deny you entry at the gates. You have served your purpose for this family, and we are done with you. I looked at the woman who had stolen my mother's fortune, hidden my true identity, and subjected me to a lifetime of psychological torture just to fund her lavish lifestyle. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt absolute pure anticipation. Enjoy the wedding, Beatrice, I said softly, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I guarantee it will be an event no one in this family will ever forget. I turned and walked out of the rectory, leaving her gloating over a legally worthless piece of paper. The final trap was officially set. The clock was ticking down the last few hours, and tomorrow morning, the entire holy empire of Greater Faith Ministries was going to burn straight to the ground. I walked out of the heavy double doors of Greater Faith Ministries and did not look back. The night air was thick with the incoming storm, but my mind had never been clearer. Beatrice was still sitting inside the opulent pastoral rectory, gloating over a legally worthless piece of paper, believing she had finally broken my spirit for good. She thought she had secured her golden child's future. She had no idea she had just handed me the final shovel I needed to dig their graves. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove straight toward the financial district. The city was quiet and asleep, but the 50th floor of Malik's law firm was blazing with light. It was exactly midnight when I stepped out of the private elevator. The glass-walled corner office looked like a military bunker preparing for a siege. Malik stood at the head of his massive glass conference table, surrounded by towering stacks of legal briefings, bank ledgers, and federal injunction requests. He had removed his suit jacket and rolled up his crisp white sleeves, his dark eyes locked intensely on the interactive digital whiteboard covering the far wall. "We need to talk about the exact timeline for tomorrow morning," Kendra Malik said immediately, tossing a heavy file onto the table as I walked in. "We are operating on a razor-thin margin of error." I dropped my bag on a chair and walked over to the monitors. "What is the complication?" Malik pulled up a digital flowchart, highlighting the intersection between Trey's hidden debts, the stolen church funds, and Chloe's family wealth. If Trey stands at that altar and signs the marriage certificate tomorrow afternoon, the entire game changes permanently. Right now, Trey's massive loan shark debts and Calvin's stolen offshore funds are isolated in their own fraudulent ecosystem. We can track them and we can seize them. But the absolute second Chloe signs her name on that legal document, Trey gains spousal standing. He will instantly mix Chloe's clean generational wealth with the stolen church money. Malik pointed to a series of red arrows connecting the accounts. He will route her father's clean money into the offshore shell companies to pay off his dangerous private lenders. Once clean money mixes with dirty money across international borders, it creates a jurisdictional nightmare. The federal government would take 10 years to untangle the financial webbing. You would spend the rest of your life sitting in deposition hearings fighting for pennies of your own stolen inheritance, while Calvin and Trey dragged out the appeals process until you went bankrupt. I stared at the interlocking lines on the bright monitor, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. "He is using the marriage license as a financial blender," I realized, my voice tight with disgust. "He does not love Chloe. She is just a human shield to protect him from the people he owes money to." "Exactly." Malik nodded, his expression grim. "We have to sever the head of the snake before the bride even puts on her dress. We cannot just disrupt the ceremony with allegations. We have to paralyze them so completely that the wedding implodes before the guests even take their seats. We need the federal freeze order tonight." I sat down at the conference table and opened my laptop, loading my proprietary forensic routing software. I had already linked the offshore account numbers, the church tithe accounts, and Trey's personal ledgers to the federal banking grid. I had bypassed their superficial security firewalls hours ago. All we needed was the legal authority to drop the guillotine. "Where is the judge?" I asked, checking the digital clock in the corner of my screen. It was 12:15 in the morning. "Harrison is handling it," Malik replied, checking his secure phone. "When you are a retired billionaire estate attorney, you have federal district judges on speed dial. He woke up a judge an hour ago. He personally delivered the DNA evidence, the forged birth certificates, and the wire fraud documentation we compiled. The judge is reviewing the emergency injunction request right now in his private chambers." The tension in the room was absolutely suffocating. Every single second that ticked by was another second. Trey got closer to slipping through my fingers. I thought about the 32 years I spent scrubbing floors while Trey drove luxury cars bought with my dead mother's money. I thought about Beatrice pinching my arm and calling me a worthless burden. I thought about Calvin standing at the pulpit preaching about honesty and divine blessings while standing on top of my stolen inheritance. They had taken my identity and used it to build a holy empire of lies. I was not going to let them take one more breath of freedom. My cell phone vibrated sharply against the glass table. It was a secure, encrypted call from Harrison Sterling. I answered it immediately and put him on speakerphone. "Are you ready?" Kendra Harrison asked. His voice was low and gravelly, echoing slightly over the secure line. "We are standing by Harrison," I said, keeping my tone perfectly steady. "Is Chloe safe?" "She is sleeping in the bridal suite at the estate venue," he replied, a trace of heavy sorrow bleeding into his normally stoic voice. "She still believes she is marrying a highly successful investment banker tomorrow. It breaks my heart to shatter her world like this. She is going to be devastated, but it is infinitely better that she cries tomorrow than bleeds for the rest of her life paying off a monster. You saved my daughter's life, Kendra. I will never forget that." "We are saving each other, Harrison," I replied, looking at the red ledgers on my screen. "Did the judge sign the order?" Harrison took a deep breath. The judge just finished reading the brief. He was absolutely horrified by the extent of the religious tax fraud and the identity theft. "Check your secure inbox, Malik." Malik quickly refreshed his dual monitor setup. A heavy encrypted PDF materialized in his inbox. He clicked it open, and the official seal of the Federal District Court glowed brightly on the screen. At the very bottom of the document was the rushed, highly coveted signature of a federal judge. "We have the freeze order," Malik announced, a feral, triumphant smile breaking across his face. "Asset seizure and immediate account locking authorized across all domestic and international institutions tied to Calvin, Beatrice, and Trey. The warrant is active. Give me the clearance codes," I demanded, sliding my fingers over my keyboard. Malik read off the federal authorization string. I typed the complex alphanumeric sequence into my software, linking the court order directly to my banking network override. I looked at the master screen. 20 different bank accounts were active and glowing green. I saw the church building fund holding millions in laundered cash. I saw the offshore trust sitting in the Cayman Islands. I saw Trey's personal checking account, his hidden business ledgers, and Beatrice's limitless luxury credit lines. I even saw the autopay account Calvin used to lease his private jet. A grand total of $45 million sitting in digital space, representing decades of deception and abuse. "Do it," Malik whispered, stepping up behind my chair. I hit execute. The forensic software surged to life with devastating speed. I watched the status bars flash rapidly across the monitor as the federal override communicated with the global banking servers. One by one, the green active icons turned a harsh, violent red. The church operational account locked immediately. Beatrice's platinum credit lines deactivated, instantly terminating her purchasing power. Trey's shadow ledgers were seized by the federal grid. The massive offshore trust was frozen by international mandate, locking the funds behind a wall of government encryption. I watched the available balances plummet in real time. $45 million dropped to zero. Trey's $2 million credit limit dropped to zero. Beatrice's accounts dropped to zero. Everything they had stolen, everything they had built their fake holy empire upon, vanished into thin air in less than 10 seconds. "It is done," I breathed, leaning back in the heavy leather chair. "The financial pipeline is completely dead. There is no money left." Malik walked over to his wet bar, poured 2 glasses of scotch, and slid one across the glass table to me. He raised his glass, his dark eyes gleaming with absolute satisfaction. "To the end of an empire," he said. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth of the amber liquid ground me in the reality of the moment. I looked at the wall of red screens illuminating the dark office. My heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm. I was no longer the frightened servant girl begging for scraps from a family that hated me. I was the architect of their destruction. "Tomorrow morning, Trey is supposed to pay the florists, the caterers, and the estate venue coordinators," I said, a cold, beautiful realization washing over me. "He has to settle the final vendor balances before they will even set up the chairs for the ceremony." Malik chuckled, a dark, satisfying sound that filled the room. "When those vendors run his cards at dawn, every single terminal is going to decline. When Beatrice tries to order her morning room service, her platinum card will be rejected. When Calvin tries to access the church emergency funds to cover the embarrassment, he will find a federal lock screen." Malik leaned over the table, resting his hands on the glass. "The only money Pastor Calvin and your arrogant brother have left to their names right now is whatever physical paper cash happens to be sitting inside their leather wallets." The trap was completely locked. The exit doors were sealed. My abusers were going to wake up tomorrow morning expecting a royal wedding, but they were stepping straight into a financial slaughterhouse. The dawn broke over the sprawling Sterling estate with a deceptive tranquility. The manicured lawns were covered in a light morning mist, but the air inside the grand bridal suite was already thick with suffocating tension and the overwhelming scent of luxury hairspray. I stood silently near the heavy oak doors, watching the chaotic symphony of wedding preparations unfold. 10 bridesmaids fluttered around the room in matching silk robes, sipping expensive champagne and laughing loudly. I was wearing the same modest beige dress from the night before, deliberately blending into the background. I was completely excluded from the glamour. There was no makeup chair reserved for me. There was no silk robe with my initials embroidered on the back. I was entirely invisible to the flock of professional stylists hired to make Chloe look like royalty. This was exactly how Pastor Calvin and First Lady Beatrice had orchestrated my entire existence. I was allowed in the room only to bear witness to Trey's glorious ascension. Beatrice was holding court near the massive vanity mirrors. She wore a custom silver gown that caught the light with every movement paid for by the offshore accounts I had completely locked down just 8 hours ago. She was beaming, radiating the toxic pride of a woman who believed she had finally secured her holy empire. She thought the signed quitclaim deed sitting in her purse guaranteed Trey's financial survival. She thought she had broken my spirit in the rectory. Then she spotted me standing by the door. Her perfect smile immediately twisted into a sneer of pure disdain. She hated that I was standing upright. She hated that I was simply watching, instead of scurrying around to serve the bridal party. Beatrice excused herself from Chloe's side and marched across the plush carpet, holding a porcelain cup of steaming black coffee. She stopped inches from my face. Her dark eyes swept up and down my modest dress with utter repulsion. "Why are you just standing there?" Beatrice hissed, her voice dropping to that familiar venomous whisper so the wealthy bridesmaids would not hear. "Do you think you are a guest today, Kendra? Do you think because you signed one piece of paper you are suddenly part of the celebration?" I looked at her, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "I am just waiting for the ceremony to begin, Beatrice." She let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "You really are delusional." Beatrice deliberately tilted her wrist. She turned the porcelain cup sideways and poured the boiling hot coffee directly onto the floor. The scalding dark liquid splashed violently against the expensive white carpet and splattered across the tips of my shoes. The heat bit through the fabric, but I did not flinch. "Servants do not stand around looking pretty," she said, handing me the empty porcelain cup. "Go to the catering kitchen and find a mop. Clean up this mess right now before someone ruins their heels. You know exactly what you were born to do, so get on your knees and do it." For 32 years, that specific tone of voice had been my absolute nightmare. When I was 10 years old, Beatrice used to pour her iced tea on the church vestibule floor right after I finished sweeping it, just to teach me a lesson in humility. She would make me scrub the tile with a toothbrush, while Trey attended exclusive summer camps. She wanted me to feel the sting of subjugation today more than ever. She needed me on my knees to validate her twisted supremacy. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the satisfaction of a fight. I walked over to the refreshment table and grabbed a thick stack of white linen napkins. I walked back to the spilled coffee. I slowly knelt on the pristine carpet right at her feet. I pressed the linen into the dark stain, watching the fabric soak up the mess. Beatrice let out a soft, satisfied hum of victory. "That is right," she mocked, staring down at the top of my head. "Keep your head down, Kendra. It is the only way you will ever survive in this family." She turned on her heel and strutted back toward the vanity mirrors, completely oblivious to the fact that I was smiling. A cold, hard smile stretched across my face as I wiped the floor. She thought she was humiliating me. She did not realize she was simply arranging the deck chairs on the sinking ship. As I gathered the soaked napkins and stood up, the heavy oak doors of the bridal suite clicked open. Harrison Sterling stepped into the room. I was dressed in an immaculate black tuxedo, looking every inch the powerful, wealthy patriarch. But his face was completely devoid of joy. His features were carved from stone. In his right hand, he gripped a heavy brushed steel briefcase secured with a biometric lock. I knew exactly what was inside that case. It held the printed offshore banking ledgers, the verified DNA test results identifying me as the true heir, and the federal freeze orders signed by a district judge at midnight. Harrison stopped in the doorway. He looked past the chattering bridesmaids. He looked past his daughter getting her hair curled. His sharp eyes locked directly onto mine. We held that gaze across the room. We did not exchange a single word, but the silence was deafening. It was a silent pact between an elite estate attorney and a forensic accountant. The trap was perfectly primed. The executioner was in the room. I gave him a fraction of a nod. I tossed the soiled napkins into a nearby wastebasket and stepped backward, melting entirely into the shadows near the corner of the room. Harrison walked over to Chloe, forcing a tight, warm smile onto his face as he kissed her forehead. He played the part of the loving father, beautifully keeping the steel briefcase tucked securely by his side. Beatrice immediately began fawning over him, praising the extravagant floral arrangements and the beauty of the estate. It was exactly 8:30 in the morning. The final vendor payments were scheduled to clear the banking grid an hour before the first guests arrived. Trey had set up automatic wire transfers, assuming my stolen townhouse deed would somehow appease his private lenders and keep the church accounts liquid. Chloe stood up from the vanity, admiring her reflection in the full-length mirror. "This is going to be the most perfect day of my life," she announced, spinning slightly so the silk skirts flared out. "Everything is absolutely flawless." The heavy wooden doors to the suite suddenly slammed open against the wall with a violent, deafening crash. The luxury wedding planner burst into the room. She was a highly paid professional who usually handled high society crises with absolute grace. Right now, she looked like she was having a massive heart attack. She was hyperventilating, clutching an iPad to her chest, her face pale and covered in a sheen of terrified sweat. Chloe turned around, her perfect smile dropping instantly. "What is wrong?" Chloe demanded. The wedding planner gasped for air, looking wildly around the room until she spotted Beatrice. "We have a massive emergency!" she cried, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "The caterers are loading the carving stations back into their delivery trucks. The florist is throwing the imported orchids into the dumpsters out back. The string quartet is literally packing up their cellos and walking down the driveway." "What are you talking about?" Beatrice shouted, storming toward the panicked woman. "Stop them right now! We have 300 guests arriving in less than an hour. I cannot stop them!" the planner screamed, holding up her iPad. The venue management just locked the doors to the grand ballroom. Every single one of Pastor Calvin's wire transfers just bounced simultaneously. The accounts are coming back completely frozen. The entire bridal suite went dead silent. The champagne glasses stopped clinking. The makeup brushes froze in midair. Frozen, Beatrice whispered, the blood instantly draining from her face. "What do you mean, frozen? That is impossible. We have millions in those accounts." The planner shook her head, tears of pure panic forming in her eyes. "The bank is saying the accounts do not exist anymore. There is absolutely no money clearing the system. The vendors are leaving Beatrice. The wedding is canceled." The grand ballroom of the Sterling estate was supposed to be a vision of matrimonial perfection, but it currently resembled the deck of a sinking ship. I slipped out of the bridal suite while Beatrice was still screaming at the hyperventilating wedding planner and made my way down the sweeping spiral staircase toward the main ceremony hall. I took my designated seat in the very back row, completely shrouded by the shadows of the massive arched doorways. I crossed my legs, resting the sleek black folder securely on my lap. The 300 affluent guests were already seated, but the atmosphere was completely toxic. You could feel the confusion radiating from the velvet chairs. Wealthy church elders, corporate executives, and Chloe's high society relatives were shifting uncomfortably, whispering behind their expensive programs. The grand floral arches at the altar were only half assembled because the design team had dropped their shears and walked off the job. There was no soft, romantic music floating through the air because the string quartet had packed their instruments into their velvet cases and marched out the service doors 10 minutes ago. At the front of the room, standing on the raised marble altar, Trey looked like a man standing in front of a firing squad. His custom-tailored tuxedo was entirely soaked with sweat. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, pulling frantically at his silk collar as if it were choking him. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching the exits, looking for a way to escape the $2 million of loan shark debt that was currently suffocating him. He knew the vendors walking out meant the wedding was collapsing. He knew if he did not get Chloe's signature on a marriage certificate today, his private lenders were going to destroy him by tomorrow. Pastor Calvin stood next to him, gripping a leather-bound Bible so tightly his knuckles were stark white. Calvin was a man who built an entire religious empire on maintaining absolute public control, but right now he was bleeding authority with every passing second. I watched Beatrice slip through a side door and hurry up to the altar. She grabbed Calvin's arm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into his suit jacket as she whispered frantically into his ear. I could read her lips from the back row. She was telling him the bank accounts were gone. Calvin's chest heaved. He looked out at the sea of restless, wealthy guests. He saw Harrison Sterling sitting in the front row, looking completely unbothered with his arms crossed over his chest. Calvin knew he was losing the crowd. He knew the whispers were going to turn into a full-blown scandal if he did not feed them a scapegoat immediately. Calvin did what narcissists always do when their backs are against the wall. He grabbed the microphone. He stepped to the center of the altar, projecting his signature booming pulpit voice across the silent, cavernous room. He painted a warm, apologetic smile on his face, dripping with fake pastoral humility. Family, friends, and honored guests. Calvin announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. I want to apologize for the slight delay in our celebration today. The enemy always tries to place obstacles in the path of a righteous union, but we will not let temporary confusion steal our joy. He let out a deep theatrical sigh, shaking his head with a perfectly rehearsed look of paternal disappointment. Unfortunately, we have experienced a minor administrative glitch with our venue coordination. As many of you know, my family believes in giving responsibilities to those who need guidance. We entrusted the financial logistics of today's beautiful ceremony to my daughter Kendra. We gave her the task of processing the final vendor transfers through her accounting firm, hoping to make her feel included in her brother's glorious day. The church gossips in the middle pews immediately gasped, shaking their heads and whispering my name with utter disdain. It breaks my heart to say this, Calvin continued, milking the crowd for every ounce of sympathy he could extract. But Kendra has always struggled with bitter jealousy regarding Trey's success. She allowed her personal spite to interfere with her professional duties. She deliberately neglected to file the bank authorizations this morning, causing our vendors to experience a temporary hold on their accounts. She tried to sabotage this holy union because she simply cannot stand to see her brother shine. Trey nodded along, wiping his forehead, playing the part of the persecuted golden child. Beatrice looked out at the audience, dabbing a completely dry eye with a lace handkerchief. We ask for your patience as we rectify my daughter's spiteful negligence, Calvin concluded, raising his hands toward the ceiling. We will not let the bitterness of one ungrateful child ruin the divine covenant we are here to witness. Please bear with us for just a few moments while we bypass her errors and authorize the payments directly. Calvin lowered the microphone, thinking he had successfully controlled the narrative. He thought he had successfully thrown me under the bus to buy himself enough time to figure out why his offshore accounts were frozen. I thought the quiet, obedient servant girl sitting in the back row would just lower her head and absorb the public humiliation like she had done for 32 years. I stood up. The heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. The sharp grating sound sliced right through the murmuring crowd. I did not lower my head. I did not shrink into the shadows. I stepped directly into the center aisle, holding the sleek black folder in my right hand. The entire grand ballroom fell dead silent. 300 heads turned simultaneously to look at me. The church elders who had just been whispering about my jealousy suddenly clamped their mouths shut. The wealthy socialites stared in stunned fascination. I did not say a word. I simply began to walk. My heels clicked against the polished marble floor with a slow, deliberate, and lethal rhythm. I kept my shoulders pulled back and my spine perfectly straight. I looked absolutely nothing like the broken maid they were used to terrorizing. I was a woman holding the detonator to a $45 million bomb. I held eye contact with Calvin as I marched down the long aisle. I watched the fake pastoral smile slide completely off his face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking gray and hollow. He recognized the shift in my posture. He recognized that the psychological cage he had kept me in for 3 decades was completely shattered. Trey physically backed away from the edge of the altar, bumping into a massive floral arrangement. His chest rose and fell in rapid, panicked breaths. He looked at the black folder in my hand as if it were a loaded weapon. I passed the middle rows. I passed the church deacons who used to ignore me when I scrubbed their sanctuary floors. I passed the front row where Harrison Sterling sat, offering me a microscopic nod of absolute solidarity. Chloe suddenly marched out from the side archway, stepping onto the altar in her extravagant custom silk wedding gown. She looked frantic and absolutely furious. Her perfect bridal facade was cracking under the weight of the missing vendors and the humiliating delay. She glared down at me as I reached the bottom of the altar steps. "What is going on here, Kendra?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and echoing in the silent room. "My wedding planner is having a panic attack in the hallway. The caterers are gone. Why did you freeze the payments? Fix this right now before you ruin my entire life." I stopped at the base of the marble steps. I looked up at the golden boy, the holy pastor, and the entitled bride. I slowly opened the sleek black folder. "I did not freeze the payments to ruin your life, Chloe," I said, my voice projecting clearly and carrying to the very back of the silent ballroom. "I froze the payments to save it. I pulled out the certified banking ledgers printed directly from the federal grid just hours ago." I looked dead at Trey, whose hands were now visibly shaking, and then I locked eyes with Calvin, who looked like he was about to have a massive coronary event right there on the pulpit. I raised my voice, ensuring every single wealthy donor, church elder, and corporate investor in the room caught every single syllable. "The checks did not bounce because of an accounting error," I announced, staring straight into Calvin's terrified eyes. "They bounced because the bank finally realized the account holder is not Calvin Jenkins, it is Althea's daughter." I stepped fully onto the raised marble altar. Calvin was shaking so violently that the microphone in his hand emitted a low, harsh feedback hum through the venue speakers. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground crumble beneath his expensive leather shoes. I did not ask for permission. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cold metal of the microphone, pulling it smoothly from his sweaty grip. He let it go without a fight. He had absolutely no strength left. He was a hollow man propped up by designer suits and stolen money, and his entire facade had just evaporated. I turned to face the 300 guests. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. You could hear a pin drop on the thick carpet. I looked at the church elders sitting in the second row. These were the exact same men who had watched me scrub the sanctuary floors on my hands and knees, while they praised Pastor Calvin for his divine prosperity. I looked at Chloe, who was trembling violently, clutching the heavy silk fabric of her extravagant wedding gown. Her wealthy relatives from the country club were frozen in their seats, staring at me in sheer disbelief. I reached into the pocket of my beige dress and pulled out my cell phone. Earlier this morning, Malik and I had bypassed the venue's unsecured wireless network, hooking my device directly into their main audiovisual feed. I tapped a single button on my screen. Behind me, the massive 80-inch high-definition monitors that were supposed to display a romantic montage of Trey and Chloe's perfect relationship suddenly flickered solid black. A collective gasp echoed through the room as a blinding white document filled the massive screens. For 32 years, I said, my voice projecting crisp and lethal through the state-of-the-art sound system. Pastor Calvin and First Lady Beatrice told this congregation that God blessed them with a miracle child. They told you I was their flesh and blood, but born with a stubborn, rebellious spirit that required breaking. They told you I was a burden they graciously carried out of holy duty. I gestured to the glowing screens behind me. "This is a certified laboratory DNA report rushed by Harrison Sterling just 48 hours ago," I announced, locking eyes with the church deacons. "It confirms with a 99.9% certainty that I am not their daughter. I am their niece." The whispers erupted instantly. A wave of shocked murmurs rolled through the wealthy crowd. Beatrice let out a strangled, horrified noise and took a step toward me, but Harrison Sterling stood up from the front row. He did not say a word, but the two massive private security guards standing at the edges of the room immediately stepped forward, placing their hands on their radios. Beatrice froze, her face twisting into a mask of pure terror. I swiped my thumb across my phone screen. The DNA report vanished, replaced by two side-by-side documents. On the left was an old yellowed piece of paper. On the right was an official state record. My mother, Althea Vance, died in a suspicious car accident 3 decades ago. I continued pacing slowly across the altar. Beatrice and Calvin legally erased my existence. On the left, you will see a fraudulent death certificate they filed claiming Althea's newborn baby died of sudden infant death syndrome. On the right, you will see a forged birth certificate they created claiming me as their own. They did not take me in out of the kindness of their hearts. They legally murdered my identity. Someone in the third row shouted, asking why. The outrage in the room was beginning to boil over. I swiped my screen for the third time. The birth certificates vanished. The screens were suddenly filled with highly complex financial ledgers. Columns of offshore routing numbers, international bank logos, and massive transfer amounts glowed brightly above the altar. They did not steal me out of love, I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority. They stole me for $45 million. Calvin let out a pathetic whimpering sound, dropping his face into his trembling hands. The church elders stood up from their pews, their faces contorted with rage as they looked at the financial documents on the screen. When my mother died, she left an estate worth $45 million, I explained, pointing at the highlighted transfer receipts. Calvin used his position as a trusted holy man to launder every single penny of my inheritance into his private ministry building fund. But he did not stop there. I swiped the screen again, revealing the church's internal operating accounts side by side with the Cayman Islands Offshore Trust. For 30 years, Calvin and Beatrice have been siphoning 10% of your weekly tithes directly into an untaxed offshore account. I told the congregation, watching the horror wash over the faces of the people who had blindly trusted this man. Every time you put your hard-earned money into the offering plate, you were funding their luxury vehicles, their designer clothes, and their private flights. You were funding the exact same lifestyle that allowed them to force the actual heir to their fortune to clean your toilets and serve your meals. "You are a liar!" Calvin suddenly screamed, dropping to his knees on the marble altar. He pointed a shaking finger at me, tears of absolute panic streaming down his face. "She is a hacker. She fabricated these documents to destroy this holy union. Do not listen to her. She is a jealous, bitter child." I ignored his pathetic display and turned my attention directly to Chloe. She was pale, shaking her head slowly as the reality of the situation crashed down upon her. I swiped my screen for the final time. The offshore accounts vanished, replaced by a sea of violently red numbers. It was Trey's shadow ledgers. "Trey did not bring you to this altar out of love, Chloe," I said, my tone dropping to a sharp, cutting truth. "He brought you here because he is drowning." I pointed at the massive red deficits glowing on the screens. Trey's luxury investment firm is a complete shell company. He owes $2 million to highly dangerous private lenders. These are not corporate banks, Chloe. These are violent street-level loan sharks operating behind corporate fronts. Trey squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling as his darkest secrets were broadcast to his affluent bride and her entire family. "He needed your signature on that marriage certificate today, so he could gain legal spousal standing," I told Chloe, watching the tears finally spill over her eyelashes. "The absolute second you said I do, he was going to drain your father's clean generational wealth into his dirty offshore accounts. He was going to use your family money to pay off his criminal debts and leave you completely bankrupt by Monday morning. That is why I froze the accounts at midnight. That is why the caterers walked out. He is completely broke and he was going to drag you down into the dirt with him." Chloe let out a devastating, heart-wrenching sob. She looked at Trey, her eyes filled with absolute revulsion. She took 3 steps backward away from him, clutching the bodice of her dress, as if his very presence sickened her. Beatrice could not take it anymore. The destruction of her perfect image, the loss of her stolen wealth, and the public humiliation of her golden child caused something inside her brain to completely snap. The fake holy matriarch vanished entirely. "You lying demon!" Beatrice shrieked. Her voice sounded feral, echoing through the silent ballroom like a wild animal. She lunged at me, her hands raised like claws, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She aimed directly for my face, desperate to tear the microphone from my hands and silence me by force. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to block her. I simply took one calm, calculated step to the left. Beatrice missed me entirely. Her own momentum carried her forward, and she tripped over the thick microphone cord, tumbling hard onto the polished marble floor at the foot of the altar. She scrambled frantically, trying to get back to her feet, screaming curses that would make a sailor blush, completely destroying any remaining illusion of her religious grace. Before she could stand upright, The heavy carved wooden doors at the back of the grand venue swung open. The deafening crash of thick timber hitting the plaster walls echoed like a gunshot, cutting through Beatrice's screaming and silencing the entire room. The heavy carved wooden doors of the venue slammed against the plaster walls with a force that shook the crystal chandeliers overhead. The deafening crash echoed through the grand ballroom, freezing every single person in their tracks. Beatrice was still sprawled on the polished marble floor at the foot of the altar, her custom silver gown tangled around her legs, her chest heaving as she stared at the entrance in absolute terror. Malik strolled through the grand archway. He wore a razor-sharp navy blue suit, his posture radiating the lethal confidence of a man who had just checkmated a king. But he was not alone. Flanking my attorney was a tidal wave of tactical vests and heavy-duty utility belts. Over a dozen federal agents marched down the center aisle of the pristine wedding venue. The bright yellow block letters spelling out FBI and IRS Criminal Investigation Division stood out violently against the sea of imported white floral arrangements and pastel silk chair covers. The heavy thud of tactical boots against the marble floor replaced the traditional wedding march. The 300 wealthy guests scrambled out of the way, pressing their backs against the wooden pews. Chloe's affluent relatives gasped, shielding their faces as the agents moved with swift, terrifying precision. The church elders sitting in the front rows stared in slack-jawed horror as the federal government invaded the Holy Union they had funded with their weekly tithes. Malik stopped right at the base of the altar, looking down at Beatrice and then up at Pastor Calvin. He did not raise his voice, but his words carried perfectly through the dead silent room. "The audits are complete," Calvin Malik said, his dark eyes gleaming with absolute triumph. "Your accounts are frozen and your empire is officially liquidated." The lead FBI agent stepped past Malik, pulling a thick stack of folded warrants from his tactical vest. He ascended the marble steps, completely ignoring the floral arches and the trembling groomsmen. Calvin stumbled backward, hitting the heavy wooden pulpit. The charming, charismatic preacher, who had manipulated thousands of devoted followers for 3 decades, suddenly looked like a cornered animal. "Officers, there has been a terrible misunderstanding," Calvin stammered, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. His voice cracked, completely stripped of its booming pastoral authority. "I am a man of God. You are interrupting a sacred sacrament. This is a house of worship, and these documents on the screen are nothing but fabricated lies from a jealous child." The lead agent did not even blink. He unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Calvin Jenkins, you are under arrest," the agent announced, his voice loud and unwavering. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, grand larceny, and international money laundering. You have the right to remain silent." Calvin let out a strangled gasp as 2 agents grabbed his arms, twisting them roughly behind his back. The cold, sharp click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the silent ballroom. The sound was absolute poetry. The man who had used scripture to justify treating me like a worthless servant was now being read his Miranda rights in front of every single wealthy donor and high society connection he had spent 30 years cultivating. On the floor below the altar, Beatrice finally snapped out of her paralyzed state. As 2 female IRS agents approached her, she began to thrash and kick, her designer heels scraping wildly against the marble. "Get your hands off me," Beatrice shrieked, batting at the agents with her manicured fingernails. "I am the First Lady of Greater Faith Ministries. You cannot do this to me. I am wearing a custom gown. Do you know who I am?" "You are a flight risk and a primary conspirator to federal tax evasion," ma'am, one of the agents replied, entirely unbothered by her hysterical performance. The agent grabbed Beatrice by the arm, hoisting her up from the floor with zero gentle treatment. Beatrice screamed as the cuffs ratcheted tightly over her expensive diamond bracelets. The diamonds she bought using the exact same offshore trust fund that held my dead mother's money. I stood off to the side, watching the destruction of my abusers with a steady, unshakable calm. I looked at the church elders sitting in the front pews. Deacon Wallace, the man who had intimidated local business owners into making mandatory church donations, was staring at the projected bank statements on the massive screens. The realization was washing over the entire congregation in real time. They were watching their trusted spiritual leaders being dragged away in chains, realizing that every single dollar they had sacrificed for the church building fund had actually paid for Beatrice's luxury lifestyle and Trey's fake investment firm. Several of the elders turned their backs in absolute disgust, refusing to even look at Calvin as the agents marched him down the aisle. Up on the altar, Trey was having a full psychological collapse. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he watched his parents, the architects of his entire privileged existence, being escorted out of the ballroom like common street criminals. Trey knew the federal freeze order meant the offshore accounts were completely inaccessible. He knew the $2 million in loan shark debt was entirely in his name. His luxury condo, his sports cars, his tailored suits, everything was gone. The violent men he owed money to would be looking for him by nightfall, and he had absolutely no shield left to hide behind, except for the woman standing next to him in the extravagant white silk dress. Trey spun around and lunged toward Chloe. He desperately grabbed both of her hands, his fingers gripping her pale skin with terrifying urgency. He dropped to his knees right there on the altar, his custom tuxedo pants hitting the hard marble. "Chloe, listen to me," Trey begged, tears of absolute panic streaming down his face. "You cannot listen to them. Kendra is crazy. My parents made some administrative mistakes with the church taxes, but I had nothing to do with it. I love you, Chloe. We can still do this. We can still sign the marriage certificate today." Chloe stood completely frozen, staring down at the man she was supposed to marry. Her white lace veil trembled as she took in his sweaty, desperate face. Harrison Sterling stepped up onto the altar, moving with the protective, lethal grace of a father defending his bloodline. He did not yell at Trey. He simply stepped between his daughter and the groveling golden child, prying Trey's frantic hands off Chloe's wrists. Harrison reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out the crisp printed financial ledgers I had provided him the night before. He handed the papers directly to his daughter. "Look at the routing numbers," Chloe Harrison said, his voice remarkably gentle, despite the chaos swirling around them. "Look at the date he drafted the transfer requests." Chloe took the papers with shaking hands. She looked down at the highlighted columns. She saw her own family trust account numbers perfectly typed into an automatic wire transfer queue. She saw the destination accounts belonging to a network of violent private lenders. And she saw that the transfers were scheduled to execute the exact second their marriage license was filed with the county clerk. The color drained completely from Chloe's face. The romantic illusion she had been clinging to shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She realized she was never a bride to him. She was just a human bank account, a desperate life raft meant to absorb the impact of his catastrophic financial failures. Trey tried to reach for her again, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Chloe, please, I just needed a temporary loan to float my firm. I was going to pay your father back. We are supposed to be a team. You cannot leave me like this. They are going to kill me, Chloe. You have to save me." Chloe did not cry. The shock morphed instantly into a cold, aristocratic fury. She looked at Trey not with sadness, but with the absolute revulsion reserved for a diseased rat. She realized she had almost tied her generational wealth and her entire future to a parasitic fraud. She reached for her left hand. She gripped the massive $50,000 diamond engagement ring sitting on her finger. "The ring Calvin had secretly purchased using my stolen inheritance just to make Trey look like a successful mogul." Chloe pulled the heavy diamond over her knuckle. "I would rather burn my family money in the street than spend a single penny saving a pathetic scam artist like you," Chloe said, her voice dripping with pure, unfiltered disgust. She reared her hand back and threw the $50,000 ring directly at him. The heavy platinum band struck Trey square in the center of his chest. It bounced off his tailored tuxedo jacket and hit the marble floor with a sharp metallic clink, rolling away toward the edge of the altar. Trey let out a devastated sob, watching his final lifeline literally bounce away from him. Chloe turned her back on him, gathering the heavy silk skirts of her wedding gown in her hands. She took her father's arm and walked off the altar, stepping right over the spot where the ring had fallen, refusing to give Trey a single backward glance. The heavy platinum ring clattered against the marble floor, spinning into the shadows. Trey stared at the empty space where his wealthy bride and his financial salvation had just been standing. The reality of his absolute ruin finally crushed the last remaining breath out of his lungs. He slowly turned his head toward me. The arrogant, custom-suited golden child was entirely gone. In his place was a terrified, drowning man with no life rafts left to steal. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us, and dropped heavily to his knees right at my feet. His expensive tuxedo pants slammed against the hard marble of the altar. He reached out his trembling hands, grasping desperately at the hem of my modest beige dress. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, looking down at him with the same detached, clinical observation I used to audit a fraudulent bank ledger. "Kendra, please," Trey sobbed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. Tears and sweat streamed down his face, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. "You cannot do this to me. You cannot let them take me. The men I owe money to, they will kill me. You know they will." He tried to weaponize the very history they had used to break me, twisting our shared trauma into a shield for his own cowardice. "We grew up together, Kendra. We ate at the same table. We lived under the same roof. I am your brother. You are my little sister. You cannot just stand there and watch my life end. Please, I am begging you. Just transfer the funds. Pay them off. You have $45 million. $2 million is absolutely nothing to you. Save my life." I looked down at the hands clutching my dress. Those were the exact same hands that had pointed and laughed when I scrubbed the church bathrooms. Those were the same hands that had gripped the steering wheels of luxury sports cars bought with my dead mother's money. I reached down and firmly pried his sweating, desperate fingers off my fabric, dropping his hands back to his sides. "We did not grow up together, Trey," I said, my voice ice cold and steady, cutting right through his hysterical sobbing. "You grew up in a palace built on my stolen inheritance. I grew up in a psychological cage designed to keep me docile. You ate prime steak in the dining room while I scraped together leftovers in the kitchen. We are not siblings. We are a hostage and a warden, and the prison riot is officially over." I leaned in just a fraction of an inch closer, ensuring my final words etched themselves permanently into his terrified mind. "Beatrice always told me that some children are born to serve. She was absolutely right. But today you are going to serve time." As the words left my mouth, two federal agents stepped onto the altar. They grabbed Trey by the arms, hauling him up from his knees with zero hesitation. He screamed my name, thrashing wildly, but the agents swiftly locked heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. He was dragged down the center aisle, kicking and sobbing, following the exact same path of public shame his fraudulent parents had just taken. I stood on the raised marble altar and surveyed the absolute wreckage of Greater Faith Ministries. The grand ballroom was a scene of unparalleled devastation. Through the towering custom-arched windows, I could see Pastor Calvin being shoved into the back of an armored federal vehicle. First Lady Beatrice was shrieking at a stoic IRS agent on the manicured lawn, her diamond necklace flashing under the harsh, rhythmic strobe of red and blue police lights that illuminated the venue's stained glass. The wealthy church elders, the hypocrites who had enabled my abuse and turned a blind eye to their leaders' greed, were frantically calling their own defense lawyers, terrified that my forensic audits would soon come knocking on their doors. I turned my back on the screaming, the crying, and the complete destruction of my abusers. I walked slowly down the center aisle, retracing the same path I had marched down just 20 minutes ago as an invisible servant. Now I walked as the undisputed owner of my own destiny. The heavy carved wooden doors of the estate venue stood wide open, held back by federal agents processing the crime scene. I stepped across the threshold and out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the late morning. The cool, crisp air hit my face, carrying the scent of absolute freedom. I took a deep, unrestricted breath, filling my lungs with a sense of peace I had never known in my entire 32 years of existence. There were no more offshore lies to untangle. There were no more marble floors to scrub. There were no more toxic whispers telling me I was a worthless burden meant only to exist in the shadows. Malik was waiting at the bottom of the grand stone staircase, leaning casually against the sleek black exterior of a private town car. He held the rear passenger door open for me, a sharp, victorious smile playing on his lips. I slid into the back seat, sinking into the plush, quiet luxury of the dark leather interior. Malik climbed in beside me, closing the heavy door and instantly shutting out the chaotic symphony of police sirens and shattered egos echoing from the venue. I rested my hands in my lap, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of the black metal card resting securely inside my purse. I had reclaimed my true identity, my $45 million fortune, and my unshakable dignity. The ghosts of Althea Vance had finally received their justice, and the holy empire that tried to erase us was nothing but ash in the rearview mirror. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror, putting the car into gear and waiting for my command. I did not look back at the estate. I looked straight ahead through the tinted glass, my eyes locked on the towering, glittering skyline of the city where my new life was just beginning. Take me to my new high-rise office, I instructed, my voice calm, clear, and carrying the absolute authority of a woman who had just conquered the world. It is time to get to work. The greatest illusion toxic families create is that you need them to survive. For decades, Kendra's abusers weaponized her self-esteem, convinced that keeping her small would keep their secrets safe. But this story proves that your origins do not dictate your destiny. True power isn't handed down. It is built in the shadows while others underestimate you. Blood means nothing without respect, and loyalty should never cost you your dignity. When you stop accepting the narrative your abusers wrote for you and finally reclaim your own truth, you realize their entire empire was only standing because you allowed it. Have you ever had to break free from a toxic family dynamic to reclaim your own worth? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more tales of ultimate payback and empowerment.